On the morning of May 21, the Romanian cavalry prepared for a new attack. At 5 o'clock, it moved out of its positions and began to advance on the town of Lozovaya. The Romanians were going to attack from the south, and we were to advance from the north and take the town. The battle was swift. At about 6 o'clock in the evening of May 22, Lozovaya was in the hands of German troops for the second time. In Lozovaya, we made a stop. We were finally given a day of rest. The next day, our unit left Lozovaya and marched towards the Seversky Donets River to Izium. On May 27, 1942, we approached the village of Petrovskoy, which was still held by the Russians. They stubbornly defended their positions, but the ring in which we took the village was tightly closed around them. We did everything we could to get into Petrovskoy, but we could not break their defenses. We needed help. The German Luftwaffe was called in to support our troops. From the moment the Air Force joined the offensive, the advantage was already on our side. We were taking one target after another. During the entire campaign, I have never witnessed such a formidable orchestra playing. The Russians realized that they had lost and tried to break out, but every tank, cavalryman, or infantryman who dared to leave the ring fell under the bombs. Yes, it was a victory, but one that I found it hard to celebrate, as we all saw the village of Petrovskoy disappear in flames. The Russian troops defending it had been exterminated. There were 1,500 inhabitants in the village, and most likely few of them survived. On the way to the burning village, the battalion commander ordered our company to mop up the trenches that began west of Petrovskoy and stretched along a row of trees to the north for about 2 kilometers. Our task would not be accomplished until we had cleared the area of the last enemy soldier. Oberleutnant Shea assembled his platoon and squad leaders to assess the situation. At 10 a.m., we received our orders and began to clear the area. Advancing along the 2-kilometer line of trenches, I thought about the fact that this terrain is familiar to me. This is the same road we retreated from Izium just a few months ago. I told my commander about it. We reached the trenches on the outskirts of the village by 11 o'clock that morning. There we were met by a German tank and its crew. They had taken prisoners and asked us for help. I told the commander that I would take care of the 2 Russian POWs. He nodded in agreement. I took command of the 1st platoon, and the commander took command of the 2nd platoon. I had the 2 Russians walk ahead of me with their arms raised so as not to lose sight of them. Behind me walked my platoon. We were separated from the commander and his platoon by a line of trenches, and I stepped through it. We were cautiously advancing through the first 100 meters of trenches when we found the first Russian soldier hiding there. He immediately raised his hands and threw away his weapon. I sent him to the platoon that was following me. On the way along the trench, I discovered several other Russian soldiers. They too had surrendered without offering any resistance. The trench was deep, replete with twists, turns, and dark corners. Eventually, I lost contact with my commander and the platoon that moved ahead of me. My comrades who followed me along the trench disappeared from sight from time to time as I walked ahead with my 2 prisoners handed over by the tank crew. Turning the corner once more, I discovered cover. In front, at a distance of 4 meters, lay a Russian fighter. He was wounded by a bullet in the knee. I addressed him in Russian, trying to pronounce each word clearly and loudly. "Are you armed?" He answered in the negative. Still keeping an eye on my 2 prisoners, I approached him and lifted him off the ground. I checked him for weapons, and finding none, sent him back to my platoon. Then suddenly I heard a whistling sound coming from cover. I moved closer, listening carefully for sounds that might have caused alarm. It was the shelter into which the dugout hole led. Through the darkness beyond the entrance, I caught a small glimmer of light. Then I shouted in Russian, "Come out now." Fingers appeared between the boards that covered the burrow and threw back the boards. 3 Russians, a senior lieutenant, and 2 soldiers climbed out. They still had their weapons, but immediately put them on the ground and raised their hands. I heard them mutter in trembling voices, "Please don't shoot. Don't be afraid." I replied, "You will not be harmed if you behave properly." I lowered the barrel of my submachine gun and headed toward the prisoners to disarm them. But barely had I taken the first step before I had to pay the price for losing my guard. A single shot followed. The bullet hit me in the upper part of my right thigh and went through my buttock. My leg went numb at once. With a groan, I collapsed to the ground, right in the loose dirt of the trench. But I quickly got up and pointed my weapon at the Russians. Gritting my teeth to ward off the pain, I stared at them intently, waiting for some action that would provoke me and allow me to return fire. But they all looked on with surprise on their faces, as if they didn't realize what had happened. They also realized that they were now risking their lives. Their gaze lowered as they stared, unarmed, at the wounded enemy with weapons pointed at them. The comrades behind me heard the shot and my shout. They rushed across the winding trench toward me. As they ran up, I saw one of the Russians try to run away. The fourth Russian, whom I did not immediately notice, was the commissar hiding behind the senior lieutenant and two soldiers who were getting out of cover under my observation. While those three stood with their hands raised in surrender, this fourth took up his revolver and fired at me. As I saw him start down the trench away from me, I calmly pulled the trigger of my automatic. The commissar fell to the ground. At that time, my platoon pulled up to me. Some of my soldiers ran up to the fallen commissar and fired a few more bullets at him with anger. The three Russian soldiers were searched and taken to the other prisoners we had captured. My comrades helped me up and led me along the rest of the trench so that we could finish the task. One of them got out of the trench and went to the commander with news of my wounding. Soon the two platoons met at the end of the trench. It was about 12:30 on the clock. The medics were called in, and they took care of our unit first. One of the doctors quickly examined me. Turning to the company commander, he reported that I needed to be rushed to the village, as a major artery was probably damaged. The commander took command of the whole company and gave the order to march back. Carrying out his order, we pulled towards the village. In total, we captured 68 prisoners. One car and a couple of horses with a cart were allocated to deliver the wounded. I was carried in the car along with 4 wounded Russian prisoners. My platoon pulled back into the trench to do another sweep before returning to our camp in the center of the village. On the way back to the village, our transport was attacked from the air by 6 Russian biplanes. It was clear that they were watching everything that happened, and we were immediately under fire. One of the wounded Russians lying next to me managed to get to the back of the vehicle. He was able to open it and roll out onto the ground on the move. Some of our soldiers stayed in the rear to give battle to the Russians still in the vicinity, while the other part of our company and the truck that was carrying me went straight back to the center of Petrovskoy. When we reached the village, I was hurried to the doctor, who immediately attended to me. After examining me, he made sure that the artery was not hit. The bullet had passed only 2 centimeters from it. Similarly, it had passed by the lymph nodes. I was left alone with the knowledge that I was going to be fine. The doctor gave me a shot against blood poisoning. It was to support me until I could receive more expert treatment. Then I was returned to the transport, which took me to the main headquarters of our troops, located in the center of the village. Here I was to spend the night, as it was still not safe to move from there, and there was still a risk of being hit by artillery fire. Only a few buildings had survived the siege of the village. Our units occupied those that were still standing. The headquarters were located there, as well as the soldiers' resting places. The living space quickly filled up. For lack of room in the houses that remained intact, the medics placed me with the other wounded in a bathhouse. Among the wounded were 12 Germans and many Russian prisoners. I tried to rest, but a little time passed, and the silence was again broken by the sounds of battle. At about midnight that night, the Russian cavalry attempted to drive Petrovskoy back. These positions were important to the Russians, as they had set up their front headquarters here. We were all lying next to each other in the bathhouse on board bunks, listening to the sounds of the battle simmering around us. No one, of course, could have predicted its outcome, but some of the wounded soldiers thought otherwise. The Russians greeted the advancing Cossacks with shouts of hurrah. Even the wounded Germans were forced, in turn, to support our side, also beginning to cheer them with shouts. I thought that the bravery they were showing looked comical, because we were completely defenseless and no one had any weapons. The thought crept into my head that if the Russians succeeded in breaking through here, we had nothing to help us defend ourselves. But for our enemy, that night proved to be a severe test, and he felt the full power of German weapons. Trying to regain the village, the enemy suffered heavy losses. The battle lasted an hour and a half, after which the Russians lifted the siege and retreated. The sounds of bursts and small arms fire quickly died down until they were completely silent. My wounded comrades also stopped screaming, and I was finally able to get some rest. A few hours later, at about 4 o'clock the next morning, the orderlies came and loaded us one by one into the back of a truck. There we were laid out line across, all 10 of us. We were taken 30 kilometers away to a reserve airfield in Barvinkov. There were 7Ju-88 airplanes on the field on which we were loaded, and at 7 a.m. the airplanes took off and headed for Dnipropetrovsk. After landing, we were taken out of the airplane and taken to a large hangar for inspection. What we saw there was a terrible picture that caused fear and anxiety in us. All the space of the hangar, as far as the eye could see, was occupied by stretchers with wounded German soldiers. There were so many of them there, badly wounded, suffering. Most of the casualties were from the Battle of Kharkov, which ended on May 29, 1942. I waited for a while until it was my turn to be examined. After a short examination, I was loaded into an ambulance and taken to a military hospital in the nearby town of Novomoskovsk, north of Dnipropetrovsk. There I lay for 9 days. On June 8, I was on my way again. I was loaded into a medical echelon, which took me to the city of Lemberg in Poland. In Lemberg, we spent 5 days. From there, the journey began through Poland, Czechoslovakia, and then into Saxony. The final destination was the town of Arnsdorf near Dresden. I stayed in Arnsdorf until the doctors announced that I was completely cured. I was lucky with my wound, as the bullet, without hitting anything, came out, and the wound was healing well. I knew that I would soon be at the front again. And on August 20, the doctors discharged me from the military hospital. The Army sent me to the Reserve Division number 164, stationed in Metz in Lorraine. On August 24, I reported to the division and was immediately given 3 weeks to recuperate and rest, plus another 2 weeks leave at home. My leave ended on October 12, 1942. I left the Reserve Division and was assigned to a field battalion at Baumholder, near Saarbrücken, where the training center was located. It was strange to call this place a training center since we were not given any weapons at all there. As I understood it, this was because the weapons were saved for combat. 2 days after my arrival in Baumholder, I was finally issued a new uniform. By that time, the battalion was overstaffed, so the youngest soldiers, mostly those who were 19 years old, were sent to a reserve unit in Metz. We were not held at Baumholder for long, and on December 4, I was back on the Eastern Front in Russia. On the way there was a stop for 4 days at Rengersdorf, near the town of Glatz. On December 12, we were on the road again, and I was again in what was once again the paradise that was Soviet territory. Our way lay through Lemberg, through Dnipropetrovsk toward the city of Stalino. From there we traveled to Gorilovka, then to Voroshilovgrad, and finally to Kamensk-Shakhtinsky. We met Christmas on the way. According to the travel documents we received, we were being taken to my former unit. However, we could not get to our division as it was in Russian encirclement and the way there was closed. So we stopped in Kamensk-Shakhtinsky, waiting for a reliable way to meet our comrades to open up. Kamensk-Shakhtinsky was bustling with life. Through the city passed formations that were withdrawing from the front at Stalingrad and others from the Caucasus region. Many soldiers were assigned Kamensk-Shakhtinsky as an assembly point. Here it was supposed to restore the front line and stop the advancing Russian armies. Unfortunately for us, the enemy now outnumbered us, and we could no longer hold them back. After a while, our troops were ordered to withdraw to Voroshilovgrad. When we were 30 kilometers from that city, we met units of the 304th Division from Saxony who were retreating, having left their positions on the Seversky Donets River. When we saw each other, we silently raised our weapons high above our heads in solemn greeting. In a few steps our paths diverged as it was to happen. In Kamensk-Shakhtinsky, I again received a new assignment, this time to the 6th Company of the 2nd Battalion of the 574th Regiment. As part of this unit, I was to go into battle again. The soldiers of this regiment had very little combat experience and absolutely no experience of fighting with the Russians. The division to which the regiment belonged had been stationed in France for 2 years, but since the vast Russian territories required new troops, it was transferred to fight in the east. Our regimental commander realized that the soldiers were uneasy, so he gathered the personnel to address us directly. He informed us that the division was to be on the front line until April 1, 1943. He concluded his address with a firm, cheerful promise. Soldiers, you are tried and experienced fighters, and I can already see on each of you the honors you will earn in the East. In the 2nd Battalion, my company had the same number of soldiers as my former unit, the 6th Company. We had received 60 additions, but when I arrived there, this new company had no commander. He was finally appointed and made his first appearance in the company just as we were about to report. Shortly after his arrival, the battalion commander assembled all the platoon and squad leaders. He announced that tomorrow at 3 a.m. we had an important military mission to accomplish. We must take back the heights that the Germans had already possessed before. These heights have already cost us many lives. Both for us and for our enemy, they were very valuable technical positions. We were on the western bank of the Seversky Donets River. Our task was to capture and hold a strip of land on the high ground on our bank. In addition, there was an enemy stronghold there, reinforced by a significant number of infantry. They had to be knocked out of there before we could begin our assault on the heights. According to the plan, we were to pass by the Russian defenses and then turn around with all weapons and equipment, pass through the settlement, and manage to capture the heights. If the Russians decided to hold their positions there, they would have to destroy our equipment and artillery, which we would transfer here. Our battalion was ordered to maneuver through the town and around the heights, to keep watch and engage the enemy if he tried to bring additional troops and equipment by water to reinforce his position on the heights. That morning, the battalion commander often repeated to us that early in the morning, that is, at 2 a.m., we would have to take the initial positions. He then departed, wishing us soldierly good luck. The company commander once again specified that the battle should begin tomorrow at 3 o'clock. At about 10 p.m., our company pulled back to Kamensk-Shakhtinsky, where the battalion's combat units were stationed. We had to advance through the countryside in deep snow. By 2 o'clock, we entered the town. We had to spend 2 long hours warming ourselves in the houses allotted to us. Then a messenger delivered an order to arrive at the starting line in an hour. Having taken what we needed, we assembled at the starting line and prepared to move out. The battalion commander was obviously nervous. It was strange to see him frantically running back and forth through the units. He ordered the company to move to the right flank, then to the left flank, then again on the right flank. Because of this delay, the enemy detected our maneuver and was ready for surprises. The commander warned us that we would be opposed by the enemy, equipped with heavy weapons, including 2 mortars and artillery. In addition, it included heavily armed infantrymen. But our soldiers demonstrated readiness for battle and disregarded the warnings. We were eagerly awaiting the start of the assault, for the original plan had called for us to strike our section at 3 o'clock, and it was now nearly 6 o'clock.